Everyone stood. Everyone except the boy with the tiny frame, the oversized suit, and the eyes that didn't blink. He was too busy reading the court file. The bailiff hesitated, unsure if he should correct the child. But something about the way the boy turned each page with methodical precision made even the court officers pause. It wasn't disrespect. It was purpose. The room settled into murmurs and shifting chairs as Judge Mathers entered and took his seat. He was used to unusual cases. Family court always was a mess of heartbreak and bureaucracy. But even he stopped, cold when he glanced down at the defense table. Seated beside the tired, weary-eyed mother wasn't an attorney. It was an 8-year-old boy. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Banks, I believe there's been a mistake. Your lawyer hasn't shown." Deidre Banks didn't answer. Instead, her son, Langston Elijah Banks, stood up, placed a hand flat on the table, and said with quiet confidence, "Your Honor, I'll be representing my mother today." Laughter cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Even the stenographer stifled a chuckle. One juror shook his head in disbelief. Judge Mathers raised an eyebrow, peering over his glasses. "Son, this isn't pretend. You're in a courtroom, not a school play." Langston didn't flinch. "With respect, Your Honor, Georgia family law does not explicitly bar a minor from representing a parent in an emergency civil hearing. I've filed the necessary forms. My mother has signed a declaration of consent, and I'm prepared to cite precedent if necessary." A hush swept over the courtroom like someone had sucked the air out of it. Even the prosecuting attorney, a seasoned man in his 40s, paused mid-sip of coffee and squinted toward the boy. He started flipping through a folder, as if double-checking whether this was some elaborate prank or a misunderstood motion hearing. The judge adjusted his robe and leaned forward. "You're telling me you want to argue a case in my courtroom? By yourself?" Langston nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand the stakes, and I understand the law." No one laughed this time. Behind him, Deidre clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Her son, who'd never once missed a day of school, who read Supreme Court rulings instead of comic books, was now standing between her and a system designed to tear them apart. And as the gavel tapped gently to open proceedings, no one in that courtroom, no lawyer, no juror, not even the judge himself, had the faintest clue. They were about to witness history. The moment Langston opened his binder, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Gone were the smirks and amused glances. In their place was a stunned, growing silence, as page by page, the boy revealed a legal mind that didn't just belong, but demanded to be reckoned with. The prosecutor, Mr. Tremblay, leaned forward and folded his hands. "All right, young man. If you wish to play this out in full, let's start with a few questions. Do you even know what custody law entails?" Langston didn't blink. "Yes. Under Georgia Code Title 15, Chapter 11, Custody, decisions are based on the best interest of the child standard. This includes considerations of emotional ties, capacity to provide, home stability, and, if the child is over 14, their preference. However, my case hinges on demonstrating that the Department of Family and Child Services acted negligently in evaluating my mother's situation. Would you like me to cite their procedural failures chronologically or thematically?" Mr. Tremblay blinked twice. The judge sat back. "Let him speak." Langston turned to a specific tab in his binder, labeled DFCS Failures, John Opper 2025. First, during the initial home visit, DFCS representatives did not account for my mother's recent employment reinstatement at Midtown Medical, where she works as a sterilization technician. Second, the social worker's report inaccurately claimed we had no electricity, when in fact the blackout was due to a city grid failure that affected our entire block. He slid a stack of printouts forward, copies of power company communications, and official pay stubs. Mr. Tremblay frowned. "That doesn't disprove the broader claim of instability." "No," Langston replied. "But it discredits the validity of the agency's report which, per case precedent in re DLW, cannot serve as primary evidence if substantial inaccuracies are found." Whispers again. One juror, an older white woman in a navy cardigan, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "He's quoting case law like a seasoned paralegal." Langston's voice never wavered. "Furthermore, Your Honor, The agency failed to provide us with notice of our right to appeal their decision within 10 days of their final report, which I contend is a due process violation. This calls into question not just the outcome, but the fairness of the process. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence him, but to steady himself. Where did you learn all of this? Langston paused. My mom used to bring me to the library every Sunday when she cleaned the offices there. I started reading old case files from the public archives section. Then I found an online bar prep forum. They let me join. I just kept learning. Across the courtroom, a teenage court intern set her pen down, wide-eyed. A child, born into the very system the court often ruled against, had learned its language, not to escape it, but to challenge it. Mr. Tremblay tried to recover. This is still inappropriate. He's just a child. He doesn't grasp the emotional complexity of these decisions. Langston raised his eyes. Sir, you don't need to be an adult to understand what it means to love your mother, or to fear losing her. Even the judge couldn't mask his emotion. For the first time in his long career, he realized he wasn't watching a court proceeding. He was witnessing a reckoning. The courtroom clock ticked steadily, but time seemed suspended. Every eye was fixed on Langston, the boy who had somehow turned a courtroom into a classroom and a lecture into a lifeline. He flipped to another section in his binder labeled Comparative Case Studies, hand-typed in bold with plastic dividers, and colored sticky notes neatly peeking out the sides. Your Honor, he began, standing now without hesitation, I'd like to introduce 3 prior Georgia custody cases where DFCS rulings were overturned for similar reasons. The judge raised his brow. Go ahead. Langston cleared his throat. In Re JWM 2017, the court ruled that the mother's prior employment instability was not sufficient to terminate custody once financial support and housing had been restored. In Re SRF 2020, the child's academic performance and emotional health were cited as critical indicators, both of which I've submitted report cards and counselor statements for. He turned to face the jury. And finally, in Re MEL 2023, the court stated that the strength of the parental bond must be weighed not by income, but by intention, demonstrated effort, and consistency. I believe my mother has met all of these criteria. He handed a packet to the bailiff to distribute. The jurors accepted the documents in silence. For the first time, they weren't watching with curiosity. They were studying him with something deeper. Respect. A younger black man on the jury, probably in his late 20s, shifted in his seat. His eyes brimmed with tears he tried to blink away. A teacher, perhaps, or a father, or someone who had been underestimated like Langston was, but didn't have the words to fight back. Langston took a breath and walked around the defense table with permission from the judge. His presence filled the space, small in stature, but colossal in intention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, voice soft yet sure. This case isn't just about whether my mom made enough money or missed a shift at work when I had the flu. It's about whether love and persistence matter more than checkboxes on a state form. He gestured toward his mother. She raised me alone, worked nights, studied for her nursing certification when I went to sleep, gave me books when we couldn't afford cable. And when DFCS knocked on our door and took me away because our refrigerator had more leftovers than brand labels, she never stopped fighting. Silence. A woman on the jury covered her mouth. Another reached for tissues from her purse. Even the bailiff stared at the ground, jaw clenched. Langston continued. I'm not asking you to ignore the law. I'm asking you to see the law for what it's meant to be, a tool for justice, not punishment. He turned back to the bench. Your Honor, I rest my preliminary case. The judge leaned forward slowly, eyes searching the boy's face. Langston, is there anything you want to say before we break for the day? Langston nodded. Yes, sir. Just one thing. He faced the jury again. Please don't measure my mother by what she lacks. Measure her by what she never let me lack, even when the world tried to take it from her. And with that, the courtroom, once skeptical, even amused, sat in stunned silence. They weren't just listening anymore. They were believing. The next morning, reporters waited outside the courthouse. What had begun as an obscure emergency custody hearing had turned into a local media sensation. Headlines flickered across news apps and social media feeds. Boy prodigy defends mother in court. 8-year-old legal wunderkind takes on. The state. Real life, a few good men, in miniature. But Langston didn't care about any of that. He sat in the courthouse break room next to his mother, quietly eating a banana and reviewing his handwritten closing statement. His small fingers traced every word, lips moving silently, repeating the phrases he'd written by flashlight under his blanket the night before. "Are you nervous?" Deidre asked him gently. Langston shook his head. "No, ma'am, because I didn't come here to win. I came here to tell the truth. If they hear it, that's enough." She blinked back tears and brushed invisible lint off his blazer. "You already won, baby, no matter what they say." Back in the courtroom, Judge Mathers sat with a deep crease between his brows. The courtroom filled quickly. Extra seats had been brought in. Local attorneys were now attending as silent observers. The energy in the room was different, heavier, reverent. Langston stood when prompted and took the floor for his closing argument. No binder this time, just his words. "When I first started reading about the law," he began, "I thought it was like a superhero code. Rules to protect people. But then I realized sometimes it gets used the wrong way, not on purpose, but in ways that still hurt." He looked toward the DFCS representatives. "I'm not mad at the system. I'm just asking it to see us clearly. My mom didn't fail me. She just didn't have help." Langston paused, letting that land. "We're not a case number. We're not broken. We're just surviving. And that should count for something." The jury remained still. Some leaned forward. Others wiped their eyes. Even Mr. Tremblay, the prosecuting attorney, sat quietly, no longer posturing. Langston looked to the judge. "Your Honor, the law doesn't have to be cold. It can also be kind. I hope today it chooses to be both." Then he sat. The silence that followed was almost holy. Judge Mathers cleared his throat. "We'll take a recess for deliberation. But before I ask the jury to begin, I want something to be entered into the official record." He removed his glasses and looked directly at Langston. "I have presided over hundreds of cases, seen Harvard graduates stumble through hearings, but I have never witnessed a clearer, more principled, or more emotionally grounded defense than what I've seen in this courtroom from you." He glanced at the court stenographer. "Let the record reflect that the court acknowledges the exceptional conduct and legal understanding demonstrated by Mr. Langston Banks. He is extraordinary." The room erupted in quiet applause, despite protocol. And though the official verdict was yet to come, everyone in that courtroom already knew Langston had changed something permanent, not just for his mother, but for every person who'd ever been underestimated. The jury filed back into the courtroom less than 2 hours later. That alone said everything. Deliberations for custody cases often stretched long into the afternoon. Pages of policy, witness reliability, reports from government agencies. But this time, it wasn't statistics or checklists on trial. It was clarity. The judge nodded toward the foreperson, a stern-looking woman in a navy blouse who had watched Langston with reserved skepticism the day before. Now, as she stood, her expression was different, almost gentle. "We, the jury, find that the Department of Family and Child Services failed to provide sufficient legal grounds for removal of the child from Ms. Deidre Banks's custody. We recommend immediate reunification and full restoration of parental rights." A collective breath, held by everyone in the room, finally released. Langston closed his eyes and lowered his head. Deidre wept. The judge banged the gavel once, lightly, more like punctuation than command. "Let the record reflect that the court adopts the jury's recommendation. Ms. Banks, custody is restored. The boy goes home today." Cheers erupted. The bailiff, who had once rolled his eyes at the sight of a child in a blazer, clapped softly. 2 jurors hugged. The court stenographer wiped tears off her keyboard. Even Mr. Tremblay, the state attorney, approached Langston with a quiet nod and extended hand. "You humbled me," he admitted. "I'll remember this one for the rest of my career." Langston shook his hand. "Thank you for being fair." The reporters outside scrambled when the courtroom doors opened. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, voices barking questions. Langston! Langston, how did you learn the law? What's next for you? How does it feel to win? But Langston didn't answer. He gripped his mother's hand tightly as they pushed through the crowd. A local reporter lowered her mic and stepped aside to let them pass. Let him have his moment, she whispered. He's earned it. They reached the courthouse steps, and Langston looked up at the Georgia sky. Brilliant and open, just like the future now. You did it, Deidre said, tears glistening like stars on her cheeks. Langston didn't smile. Not exactly. He just looked thoughtful. No, Mama, he said softly. We did it. You never gave up on me. I just gave the world a reason to stop giving up on you. She knelt and hugged him hard. And in that moment, on that cracked courthouse, pavement with reporters watching and strangers crying, it didn't matter that they had been poor or doubted, or nearly torn apart by a system that never expected a child to speak law like a professor. All that mattered was that he had spoken, and the world had finally listened. Epilogue. Year later, Langston Elijah Banks was awarded an honorary certificate in civic engagement by the Georgia Bar Association. He still couldn't legally drive or vote, but that didn't stop law schools from mailing him scholarship offers anyway. His case was studied in family law seminars nationwide, and at night, long after the noise faded, he still read case files, by flashlight, not because he had to anymore, but because he was already preparing for the day when he would write the laws, so no kid like him would ever have to fight alone again.